Hey YouTube, Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Today's episode is with the journalist Wesley Lowery. We're talking about racial backlash in America. We're going to cover a bunch of different topics, everything from the reparations debate to the defund the police debate to everything in between, especially the Obama presidency to today. So lots of great stuff here, lots of interesting perspective. Would definitely love to know what you think. This is the perfect follow-up to the previous episode I just did of Peter Turchin. That episode focused on America through the lens of power, class, and education. And today's is all focused on the lens of race. Hope you all enjoyed the conversation and have a great rest of your week. Wesley Lowery, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to start by going through a bunch of definitions of terms and concepts that are covered in the book, but also are reflected in your reporting and writing. I'd love to hear your definition of backlash.
Well, backlash, I think backlash is anything that is a negative response registered to a development or a step, right? And so in this specific sense, I'm thinking about the backlash to recent current events and the perception of advances towards multiracial democracy, right? So the book's titled American Whitelash. And so you go from backlash to whitelash. Well, let's talk about what is white and what is whiteness, right? Now, we know that race is a biological fiction, that there are not races, that humans are all the same. And the science tells us that, and if you're a person of faith, pick your faith, they all tell us that too. But science has proven it. And so what is whiteness? Whiteness is race is why it's a biological fiction. Race is a societal, sociological reality, right? That we have created a caste system based on how people are perceived racially. That's a caste system that is not inflexible, that the way they are coded racially can shift and can change both in specific context as well as over time. Whole groups can move from one thing to being the other. And that in the United States of America, by law, since the colonial times, we have codified this type of racial caste system into our laws. We wrote that white Americans had one set of rights and that others had another set of rights. We created the distinction. And so when we talk about a whitelash, right, what we're talking about is a backlash, a negative response from the majority of Americans who are codified as white to steps and what they perceive as progress towards a fully multiracial democracy and a multicultural society.
So this is where my ideological priors make me very curious about this question. I don't just mean my ideology, I mean just my frame of the world. I'm pretty centrist in my politics, and I'm also an interviewer. I'm not an activist. I'm not a politician. So there are certain things that I think you would do that I understand an activist wouldn't like to do. To what degree do you think it is the responsibility of an activist to guard against backlash? So for example, the reason I'm asking that is if you were to take me and drop me into BLM in June of 2020, I'd be the guy who's saying, well, look, if we say this thing with defund the police or we do that thing, it's going to cause center-left parts of the Democratic Party's coalition to get really concerned, like on and on and on and on. So I have one approach towards guarding against backlash, but I would admit that activists who have different roles in our societies than interviewers or media people do are going to have a different perspective. So given your reporting, your writing, how do you think they should conceive of backlash and whether it should be guarded against or as a cost of doing business?
I think I really appreciate that question because I think very rarely do those of us in the media acknowledge that our job is fundamentally different than the job of activists, right? Now, I mean, I think we assert that all the time and try to define ourselves against activists, right?
It's
but what I mean,
implicit.
right? But what I mean by that, rather though, is that our sensibility and our kind of status quo bias might be fundamentally and functionally different, right? In the same way that I talk to my attorney friends about whether or not details of an investigation should leak, they have a different perspective as people whose the Hippocratic oath is to their attorney-client privilege than me, whose professional goal is to get information and put it into the public, right? And so when we think about, and I actually do think members of the media at large, we talk all the time about political bias, and I think some of that's overblown, but they're members of liberal institutions, and I don't mean that politically, but I mean kind of in the broad, classically liberal sense, right? That broadly believe in a multiracial democracy and broadly believe in the exchange of ideas and extra, right? And so because of that, I think very often individual members of the media see themselves as theoretical ideological allies of a lot of activists, even though tactically we read from different holy books, right?
Yes.
I say all that to say, I think that I say all that to say, I think that at almost every juncture of almost any movement that's made significant societal change, you could go back and argue that things being said went too far, were too radical, were going to prompt backlash, that in most historical cases, such things were being argued, right? And that it can be very difficult to suss out what is true and what is not, in part because when you're a member of an ideological movement and your opposition are members of an opposing ideological movement, you cannot pretend as if this all operates within an intellectual good faith, where Barack Obama is going to pass Mitt Romney's healthcare plan because he's scared of backlash if he passes single payer, they're going to call it socialism. And then what does the conservative movement do? They argue that Mitt Romney's healthcare plan is socialized medicine, right? Like that trying to triangulate this for like intellectual honesty is actually unhelpful, right? In that it's limiting in a way that, well, all right, there is an argument. I'm not making it, but there's an argument that if you're going to be called a socialist anyway, then do socialism, right? Then do it, right? Like and very often what we see in our politics is a triangulation in that way that ends up leaving basically no one happy. In this particular context, right, there's also a difference between short-term and long-term backlash. Almost any act of activism, almost any act of political activism, social activism is going to lead by its very nature to blowback. The question is the short-term blowback worth the long-term potential achievement or a potential change, right? And so a similar counterfactual works in the other direction, right? Well, okay, the desegregation of American public schools led to the rise of a hyper-conservative homeschool movement, led to the rise of segregation academies, hyper-private education that actually zapped a lot of resources from public education, right? That a step towards creating equality under the law could be said to have resulted in a backlash that furthered a bunch of inequities or at least codified them moving forward. I think very few civil rights activists would and frankly, I think very few legal scholars would agree that then with the suggestion then we shouldn't have done school desegregation, right? Because the country is going to react in such a racist way to this, we just shouldn't do we shouldn't do the right thing. I think you end up in a complicated, I'd be interested in an ethicist on it, or you're like, I'm all right. But I do think you find yourself in a very complicated and potentially compromised ethical position when you're saying, I know what is right, but I'm not doing the thing I think is right because I'm scared that me doing what is right will prompt someone else to do what is wrong.
Yeah. And I guess for me, the reason why I'm asking this question is this leads into 2020 with the defund the police debate. Because from my perspective, obviously Black Lives Matter, you're reporters, I don't need to tell you this, but became inherently controversial. But that to me seems like a category of, if you're going to engage in any sort of pushback against the status quo, like the term Black Lives Matter is going to offend a certain very specific white suburban voter who many politicians who are ideologically allied with you are going to be concerned about. It seems to me, though, that the defund the police rhetoric specifically edged too far into this is pushing the status quo, but it kind of upset the apple cart in a way that wasn't inherently helpful. So I guess part of reading your book and just talking with you here is just trying to understand how this all fits together. Because once again, because I'm coming from the media perspective, I just don't understand. So help me, I guess, understand better how you'd think about it.
I think about it a few different ways. And I think for some of the reasons I laid out before, I think the jury is still out on it. I think we're far too close to 2020, right, to assess anything but the short term.
Okay, yeah,
right. That.
Wait, quick pause. Then, could you define what the long term would be? Then, let's start with it. Let's start there.
Sure. Well, I think about it this way, right? Let's go backwards one cycle, right? And you noted this, right? That initially, so Black Lives Matter as a rallying cry emerges in 2013. Following the acquittal of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin's death, the death of Jordan Davis, and the release of the movie Fruitvale Station about Oscar Grant's death. And then gains national prominence the following year in 2014, following the deaths of Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, right? At the time, there was significant media and political rendering of garments and debate about whether or not the term Black Lives Matter was counterproductive, whether it was going to undermine the greater message, whether it was needlessly divisive because all these white people were offended, and what about white lives matter and all lives matter, and all. I mean, it was a constant political debate about the tactic. And then we get to 2020. Where George Floyd's been killed. Now, a lot happens in those 6 years, right? There are many, many other police killings. There are many other cases that fall into this. You have things like Flint, Michigan, or other arguments around whether or not the systemic or structural inequities in the United States of America as it relates to Black people, and whether or not our society fully values their humanity, right? Lots of things that can fall under this kind of Black Lives Matter umbrella. And we see the election of Donald Trump happens in this period of time, and the rise of the MAGA movement and his steps he takes administratively. We see the rise on the left of a resistance to combat him. By the time we get to 2020, meanwhile, on the actual issues that this arises from, we've seen thousands of police departments actively publishing the data. Almost every police department in the country is putting body cameras on. Public opinion has shifted drastically. That at the time in 2014, that you would even ask questions about what a police officer had done was you were veering towards controversial. Now, basically, no matter your politics, every person out there has a video they've watched where they go, well, that cop shouldn't have done that. I agree that was, I mean, it's hard for us to remember how in 2014, the idea that you would ask any questions meant you were anti-cop and you hated the police and X, Y, and Z. Right now, everyone of every politics agrees that there are cases where this is happening and it's unacceptable, right? And in part because of all these videos that are produced in part by everyone pulling their cell phone cameras out, in part because of this movement and this activism, and because of all these body cameras that got put on everyone everywhere due to this movement and this activism. By the time we get to 2020, Mitt Romney is marching in Black Lives Matter protests. So the thing that was so counterproductively aggressive is completely politically malleable, and is no longer in any way considered radical in what is a very short amount of time. All things considered, 6 years is not a billion years.
On the civil rights timeline, if we were looking at previous, that 6 years is nothing.
It's nothing, right? There's not any. And so I say all that to say, right? And so I think that I think that's one of the reasons there's a reason I go there in talking around defund and these other questions, right? Is that it's been 3 years. And what has happened, by the way, and I've seen this happen time and time again, what happens in this very specific space, not just around civil rights, but I think even specifically in law enforcement and justice, is that what happens is when we have these inflection point moments, it forces some sets of people within the institutions, some police departments, some prosecutors, some academics, some whomever, because we have this diffused criminal justice system that's a bunch of systems stapled together. It prompts some people to take aggressive steps forward. And then what happens is it gives them time to work out and work through either best practices or what doesn't work or what does. And then the next time one happens, everyone is looking for something they can take off the shelf and do, right? That I want my police, that the next time you have and so you see in these moments, in these inflection point moments, a bunch of stuff happen very quickly, then it all stopped. That Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson. And around this 2014 moment, you have dozens of states that pass legislation to have independent prosecutors. You have thousands of police departments put body cameras on. You have it all happens, right? And then it stops, but it all happens. You get to George Floyd and a bunch of stuff happens really quickly, whether that's these anti-racism trainings or whether it's, you do have places that take steps to say, we're going to de-police. Let's not do armed traffic stops. Let's expand mental health services. We now have a national phone number to dial instead of 911 for a mental health crisis, right? And so that was not true the day George Floyd was killed. And so you see these massive things all happen at once. What is also true is there have been places that have piloted and played around with things that we can pick whatever lingo or rhetoric we want to, right? Things that that in spirit, you would argue are defunding, that others might use the term depolicing, right? But there are places that have explored that. And we know, unfortunately, there will be another George Floyd moment. There will be another video. And so part of the question becomes, and we don't know the answer till it plays out. And I'm not of the belief that it's necessarily all going to go in one direction. But the question becomes, did the rhetoric around defund, abolition, any of it, did it open a large enough window for enough people to do work in that spirit that by the time we hit the next moment, those are some of the solutions being taken off the shelf and applied more broadly? And if so, I think retroactively, there might be an argument that, well, actually, that's exactly what was needed. It put the tools in the toolbox for the next step. And I think that is part of the kind of non-linear equation of this, right? That on issues that are so entrenched and that are so controversial, and frankly, that are so embedded in our society and its structures, it's not going to be that all right, and that we're going to pass 18 things in a row and they're all going to cut in the same direction and then we're going to fix racism. And then by February, it's not some first 100 days plan to get rid of, right? That the reality is, in a civil rights context, there's an understanding of a longness and length of struggle that I think there's an argument. I'm not arguing that it was politically salient. I'm not arguing that there was not backlash or blowback to it. And I'm not arguing that it is inevitable that it will end up having paid off. What I would say is, I think we're a reckoning or two from knowing the answer to it.
What's a reckoning? Define a reckoning.
I think it's a moment where I don't love the word, but it gets adapted in media, so we'll use it, right? I think it's a moment where every one of us, I guess I'm not included in the us in this, in which the people in our country whose professions and livelihoods do not involve paying attention to an issue are forced to pay attention to said issue.
Okay.
Right. That 2014 around Eric Gardner, Ferguson, Tamir Rice creates such a moment, right? Where it's a thing the populace writ large is just talking about and agitating for something. George Floyd, 2020, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, right? That there are these moments where suddenly there is collective appetite to try to address collective problem. And then they dissipate, right? Because there are people in between who are actively trying to address all the problems. It's their job to, they care about them, right? It's that everyone else is too busy off dealing with whatever other. There are plenty of people who were very concerned about pandemics before coronavirus, working very hard, trying to do all these, right? Suddenly, there's a moment around health pandemics where there's a collective appetite for collective action around, So what I would imagine is, so again, we've got the kind of 2014 to 2016 moment. Then we're a little more dormant in this space. Again, not that people are not doing work and are not active, but it's just a different space. Then we hit this 2020 moment where we see a lot of stuff happening. I would argue, I think we're in one of those lulls afterwards.
Mhm.
And we could log off this conversation, open our phones and see a video, and we could be back in another moment.
Yeah.
And in the same way that the day before the George Floyd video, we wouldn't have been able to predict the extent and the broadness of the response to it. Not saying that I don't have critiques of that response or that I think all of it was good, but we couldn't have seen the extent to which there would be a response. That video we haven't seen yet that might publish tonight or publish tomorrow, it's impossible for us to conceive of what might come from it.
You just gave me an idea that kind of brought together a bunch of different things I've been covering on the show. It seems like something early 21st century America is particularly bad at is not letting public issues require reckoning points to have them be addressed. So an example, yes. For example, all the things that led to the war in Ukraine, there was this like 30-year period where most people just didn't pay any attention to it until, Russia's 3 days outside of Kyiv. You have these low periods where we're not focusing on policing, crime, racial issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden something will happen and we'll be in a reckoning situation. And it seems like, especially when you're looking at the type of people who tend to control institutions, where, once again, I'm sort of dispositionally focused towards center left to center right people, they themselves are not particularly talented at managing reckonings. I think this goes in both directions. Yes. I think, I'm doing this from like Austin, Texas. I think a lot of, it's kind of funny. I think a lot of the BLM post 2020 backlash, if you actually talk to quote unquote normal people who don't focus on these issues, are people are reacting to center left to center right people, mostly center left in yes. urban regions, who found themselves in the reckoning moments, kind of lost their shit and didn't think it through. So, for example, in Austin, an example would be the Austin City Council kind of panicked and canceled like the next 2 classes of incoming police, which led to down the line some issues there. So now the kind of rhetoric on the street is, hey, like all this woke shit got out of control, and because of BLM, we don't have cops on the street. Now the state of Texas has to come in, blah. So I guess my question for you is, how do you advise any just sort of, and once again, in this topic area, we're basically talking about center-left people, how can they actually be ready for reckoning moments if we know they're coming? And also, this is a rant, but I'll just give the last part of it. The key thing is, because we're in a hyper-polarized moment, reckonings are required to force through change. So it's not as if you can just show up in Congress in, let's say 2011 and be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to be the guy who focuses on militarization of police. Or, hey, do you guys notice how we're drawing down in Iraq? Where are those MRAPs going? Are they going to police forces? Like, maybe we talk about that. That system isn't going to happen in a polarized country. So I just threw a lot of stuff at you, but love your reaction, how you think people should navigate it.
Sure. I mean, I think it's really astute to observe that 2 things. One, I agree completely with your observation that we do a very poor job. That, look, fundamentally, protest, public discontent, public debate stems from places where our ruling institutions are not meeting an expectation, a need, a desire of their people, right? Because otherwise we would just call our congressmen and say, hey, do this, and they would do it, and then we wouldn't have to do any of the other stuff, right? Or we would vote someone out or vote them in, or right. And I think that it's actually unsurprising to me that very often we see ideological movements grow at times when their theoretical political allies are in power. Mm-hmm. That BLM starts during the Obama administration, not during the Bush years, not during the Trump years, right? Now, again, some of that's confluence of technology and cameras and all, a non-insignificant part of it, right? But it's unsurprising to me that you have
the civil rights movement, JFK, LBJ, same dynamic there.
Correct, right? And because these movements rise to push their ideological allies further towards what they believe to be the virtuous or just way of operating, right? That it's tactically completely different when you don't control the levels of power. When you do control the levels of power, it becomes even incompetence or inaction becomes even more unacceptable, right? And so it's like, no, why aren't we fixing this? Why aren't we? That it's unsurprising that after an outsider Democratic president, Barack Obama, is elected and then bails out the banks, that we see the rise of Occupy Wall Street. Why? Because people from his own coalition were upset with, and again, that's not actually that's not an argument against him having done that. That's not to say it even is a fair 1-to-1, right? But in these moments where people feel as if their leadership, the leadership they ally with, is failing them, you see these rises. Secondarily, I think that it builds to, because of the polarization and because our institutions are made up largely of that moderate middle, it creates an inability to function. I actually think at times there can be, and I'm sure there's a body of research on this, I think there can be a pragmatic paralysis in that what is difficult is, I was just talking to a writer friend about this over the weekend, that leadership often requires doing both difficult and unpopular things. And the right things are very often unpopular, whatever they are. And I think that in a world in which we, both in our polarized society, but also in which the people running most of our institutions come from that middle set, where they see themselves as drawing their own support from a world of people who straddle both sides of these things, where they care a lot about where the 50+1% is and the polling. I think that can be a set of handcuffs against doing things that are unquestionably the right thing to do and what people sent you to you and placed you in your position of leadership to do. You think about many of the, look, I'm a Black man, but I'm biracial. My father's Black, my mom's white. I'm very glad that interracial marriage didn't rely on a popular vote to become legalized, because it probably still wouldn't be. Right? Like, it's just the much of what happens, it would be if we voted today, right? But the polling we see today comes because people have lived in a world where it was made legal, right? That sometimes you do the thing and then it becomes popular. That no one likes the Affordable Care Act until everyone's on it, and then they're like, do not take this away.
Yeah.
Now, so again, it speaks to a limitation of seeing the world purely through cyclical partisan politics. Sometimes you got to take a vote for the right thing that's going to cost you your seat, right? But beyond that, what I would suggest is, and I don't even mean this in a partisan way, what I would also suggest is that the vast majority of difficult issues require, if not unpopular solutions that create some level of political vulnerability. That's not to say that we figured the whole world out, but we have problems in our society where we have pretty clear bodies of evidence of ways we could go about addressing them. And so the question becomes, why haven't our institutions addressed them? And it's because we've built a system that incentivizes them never doing anything. It's like that incentivizes, look, we know how to, I mean, guns is an adjacent issue where we know any number of very specific ways to limit gun deaths and reduce gun deaths. But our political world incentivizes bad faith discussion of these things, people not to acknowledge that body of research. And then when there finally is a moment, to pass legislation that objectively will not solve the problem, right? That even in the moment, to go back to my actual area of expertise, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, supported by George Floyd's family, who I know, and many of these activists, and not to weigh in on whether the legislation itself should be passed or not, but I think it is noteworthy that there's nothing in that legislation that would have prevented George Floyd from dying. So even
that, so help us understand that.
So a federal ban on chokeholds would not have saved George Floyd's life. The creation of a officer misconduct database would not have saved George Floyd's life. Qualified immunity, which was a thing that they ended up fighting about and taking out, but even if included, it's a bank shot. Theoretically, if Derek Chauvin believed he might have been able to be held civilly liable, would he have behaved differently? There's no guarantee that changes anything about what happens that day, right? That the actual the ability of the Justice Department to remove some of its funding from local police departments that don't comply with training standards would not necessarily have. The Minneapolis Police Department is one of the best trained in the country before this happens, right? So what we end up seeing are the applications of solutions that come from a list of things that activists in the area would say are good. And I'm not even suggesting that they shouldn't do those things or pass those things, right? But that fundamentally stop short of solving the underlying problem, of preventing another George Floyd, right? That we a different
there's the obvious question though. What would quote, and let's say we're getting into like a difficult solutionism discussion.
Sure.
But the obvious question is what law, regulation, practice, et cetera, would have saved George Floyd's life or future George Floyd?
Well, I think there are a few things. I think that there are, and I won't necessarily say that these things guaranteed would have, but they're the types of questions we have to grapple with to come to such solutions, right? Is that we have to grapple with the question of, does it make sense for us to police our country with 18,000 individualized local militias, as opposed to, say, one more centrally located, standardized policing force, right? Does it make sense that your policing experience might change so drastically when you cross a municipal boundary in one direction or the other? And that's not an advocation for, say, one, now many democracies would you operate with a singular nationalized police force. You could see a world where perhaps you had state level police forces that have to have some, but like there's a major, why can't we fix this problem? Well, part of it is that we have to fix whatever the problem is in 18,000 individualized places. We can't fix it once because there's no nationalized, federalized oversight or standards, right? There are little bits of it, but not in any functional way, right? A conversation like, so that might suggest that one thing the federal government could do is it could grant itself additional oversight or additional review ability, right? We currently see police departments that undergo these they call patterns and practices reviews by the Department of Justice, where they come in and turn over all the rocks. And as it turns out, this institution's really bad at doing the things it's supposed to do and perpetuates all these racial inequities. Well, that power was granted, Congress granted the power to conduct these investigations in 1994 following Rodney King. That didn't exist prior to that, right? And so you could see a world where the federal government granted itself additional oversight, additional capacity to oversight. Questions about depolicing. So again, things I think we are seeing in some local municipalities, right? But okay, well, one way to have government agents kill fewer people is to dispatch fewer armed government agents to a variety of different types of things. That, okay, we probably want armed officers going to the bank robbery. Do we need armed officers getting your cat out of the tree, or to the call about a drunk guy outside, or to a call about your teenage brother having a mental health crisis, right? And so what we have seen at a local and state level have been many steps towards the pursuit of the type of scenario in which someone maybe on drugs, maybe passing a counterfeit bill, isn't responded to by 10 guys with guns and badges and the right to kill you if they get upset. That is what happens in George Floyd's case, right?
I think this is where this gets difficult, though, because and this is why policing is so complicated. There's a million different policy areas and areas of concern. But on the one hand, I see a federal system when it comes to training standards makes a lot of sense. But when you're discussing does it make sense to have the person who's getting the cat out of the tree have a gun or not, that seems to me to be a case of, well, you know what, maybe like Austin is going to have a different answer on that than San Antonio, or a different answer than Washington, D.C., or a different answer than San Francisco. So I'd like to hear your understanding of how we should, and also from a democracy question, because that's what we're ultimately speaking towards.
Yes.
Is it inherently more democratic to let localities decide this versus Donald Trump's DOJ? You know what I mean? Because that would be federal if there was unitary control in 2017. So how should we understand the federal? Because the federalism question goes a bunch of different directions here.
Yeah. So I do think at its heart, this is a federalism question, right? And I think that there are a lot of ways. And so the question I actually think is, how should the scales be balanced
Mm.
on something like, again, state agents who are empowered to take lives. What is the balance between how much of that is federalized versus how much of that is local, and what's the interplay between those things? Right.
That's the central question here.
I think that's, yes, right. Secondarily, I think that's the central question to policing.
Mm-hmm.
Secondarily, 1B is, what do you do with an armed populace? That the answers to these questions are a lot easier for Britain. Right. Like, it's like night and day difference. It's one of the reasons we try to do these comparisons. Well, the UK polices in this way, and they don't have any guns. It's a totally different scenario. Right. And so at the heart of understanding our possible remedies, as well as thinking about it's very hard to divorce the conversation about firearms from the conversation about the people charged with ensuring public safety, because they expect they're encountering people with firearms, even when they are not. But that expectation is not unreasonable for them, right? So again, I think first you got that federalism issue, which again I think is a fascinating, because there's any number of different ways you could try to do it, right? Yeah. Do you say, all right, we have a certain accreditation process, like that it's run locally, but you have to pass a certain federal accreditation, and so federally we can ding you on X, Y, and Z, but on these questions, these are your local municipalities, right? And again, one might note an ability for a suburb that deals with no gun violence to operate with no armed officers might look different than a place that is awash in weapons, right? And they might want to have that flexibility and the ability to do different things, right? It cuts in all types of different ways. And so I do think that you have that on the one hand. The problem is you also have equal protection, though, right? So what happens if in one state my right to not be unreasonably searched and seized means one thing, or not face discriminatory traffic stops means one thing, and then I cross into Missouri and suddenly it's a different, well, shouldn't my right in one state be, and we see this on any number of issues, you see this on abortion, on guns, right? There is now with policing, there's not quite a commerce clause claim here, right?
Yeah.
So it's this question of, well, if in New York City and Boston, the judge says that stop, question, and frisk in its application is clearly racially discriminatory, why is it okay for me to now experience that when I cross the state lines into Missouri? Right? I actually do think there's an interesting, from like a legal, federal, constitutional perspective, this sense of because police by their nature are people empowered to deny people their rights. Even just by handcuffing them, by stopping them, by detaining someone, you are denying them their freedom and their liberty. I don't mean that in like a dramatic way. I just mean like literally that's what it is.
No,
right?
it's good to actually. I also, by the way, I like your use earlier of state empowered agents. It's actually helpful to describe what's actually happening here and not to engage in euphemism.
Yeah, like it's the government, like the people who the government employs and gives guns and says keep everyone safe, do basically what you want to do, right? Like it's this question of what role does the federal government play in ensuring that there is some level of equality and equity to how that's meted out across 50 states, right? And obviously, people of different politics are going to draw that line in different places, but I think everyone would agree there is a line to be drawn, right? That there's some role for federal oversight. And I think that one thing that's a question of our democracy, just by the nature of our history, is we're a system where much of our bureaucracy was built from the ground up. It was localized and then state, and then, right? And so what happens and so the question for a lot of our institutions, from schools to hospitals and access to medical care, to policing, to the media, at what point as a massive functioning democracy do some things get ascended up to a federal level, and where are those lines and how does it operate? Right? At what point does the union have an obligation to guarantee a certain floor of equality of rights of experience, And what happens as over time that floor shifts and changes and rises, hopefully, right? Like that, and again, I think on any number of issues, from minimum wage to how we handle unhoused people and homelessness to mental health services, there's a big tension between people who would say that to be the richest nation in the history of the world, our floor is just way too low in too many places, but to fix that fundamentally would require some type of collective decision to raise that floor. And at some point, you got to overrule someone to do that.
I think this gets to the difficulty of the reckoning reality we discussed earlier, just because if you're thinking about why does the federal system look the way it looks, like why does the Defense Department look the way it looks? Well, because World War II happened. That's the definition. That's the definition of a reckoning period. The early Cold War happened, so you have the National Security Council, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
9/11 happens when we get DHS, right? Like
exactly. We have a system that's not. This is for younger people who are listening. A real generational task, it seems, across all these categories is finding a way to do things without requiring things to be pushed to the limit. As we're nearing the end here, I want to get to this big topic, because this is where I'm very curious about, and I'm very, very concerned when I'm speaking to folks who are more in the activism part of the direction. I'm interested in your usage of the term multiracial democracy, because I don't want to say obviously, because this is just not true, but I think most people, actually, no, the broad majority of the country, except a couple weirdos, would say at a superficial level, obviously we're in favor of like a multiracial democracy, like status quo. You are alleging, by the nature and framing of this book, that there is, backlash towards efforts to make us a fully functioning multiracial democracy. So here's what I'd like to understand. On the one hand, I understand there are like voting rights controversies where a bunch of folks up to the right of me would say no, the federal government's gone too far. This isn't fair. But I would just say that even if we're debating, I could really see voting rights as being no, that's a part of that issue. I'm concerned though that debates around reparations and specific policing orientations have transcended away from are actually policy debates, and they're not values debates. And I wouldn't want to have a situation, because I've seen it happen, where someone who doesn't support reparations, which is super complicated on 15 different levels, is categorized as opposing taking America to its most multiracial democratic extent. Because I could obviously see how, if you're an activist, you could argue, actually, no, people have to be made whole. If they're not made whole, they're not fully participating members in democratic. So I could understand how an activist gets there. But I think from a how do we solve policy questions perspective, voting rights is in a different category than reparations. So how do you understand the taking us to our most multiracial democratic context when you're using the term? How do you think of this?
Sure. I think that's a really thoughtful question too. And I have to think about it as I initially think about it. I don't think I'm someone who would put support for reparations, say, in that bucket, right? As if you do not support, then therefore you are oppositional to X, Y, and Z, right? But what I will say is that, so I think a few things, right? And I agree with you that the vast majority of our country supports, in polling, and I think actually in sincerely held belief, would purport to support multiracial democracy.
Yeah.
Right. Now, granted, there's space very often with what people say their values are and what their lived values are. Right. And so just because you say you support a thing or want to believe you support a thing does not necessarily actually mean that in function you do. Right. I think that if you are someone who supports state legislators who purposely draw maps to delude the power of minority voters in your state, I think it's very hard then to argue that you are a full proponent of multiracial democracy. You are supporting actions to create an inequitable voting system.
And that's why I put voting in its own bucket, because the way you just articulated it, the reason why voting is so interesting and bad for people, obviously, in this case, is it's actually, you can kind of get empirical with it, right? In a way, there's once you agree to the whole thing, like, hey, dude, are we one person, one vote in this country? It's pretty straightforward. To your point about like we know certain answers to certain questions. To like catalog, okay, well, this person cannot exercise their rights in the same way. It gets screwy when you get into policing, reparations, educational debates. But yeah, sorry, go on. I think it's
no, of course. Well, but even to build off of that point, though, so have we achieved our multiracial democracy? Have we achieved our multiracial democracy if our institutions are still structured in ways that counteract one person, one vote? Is it possible for America to have a truly equal and equitable? I'm asking the question because I don't even know exactly how I would answer it if you had asked me, right? In a world where me sitting here in Washington, D.C., do have no say in the United States Senate, in a majority Black city in the South, where slaves were once held, right? Where my vote is literally not the same as yours in Texas, right? Is that, and that's not exclusively racialized, although there are, this is a, a plurality to it. There's a plurality Black city in the South, right? Is what happens when a Black person's vote in Los Angeles or New York City functionally counts for less than a white person's vote in Wyoming or Idaho. Mm-hmm. Right? That we've, by the nature of the system we have set up, we have embedded things that in some cases were explicitly intended to, but not all of them. But
like DC's like DC's one of those, like, it didn't, like the DC's actually the perfect example of what you're getting at.
But there are cases where this kind of played out this way. There are other cases where when they wrote it at the time, they were like, and this is to keep the Black people from being more of them than I think sometimes we're comfortable grappling with, where it's like, where did this come from? And if you pull the string far enough, it's someone saying something abhorrent, right? Like, but what happens? Like, what does it look like for us to pursue a fully fledged multiracial democracy if what we believe that means is that no matter your race, you have an equal claim to the promises of American freedom, right? And I think that so one, I think that's one whole bucket where I think there is actual that like to create a multiracial democracy in its ideal, you would never create the system as it exists currently. You would never say, all right, we've got this country of X hundred million people. These are the broad racial and ethnic breakdowns. Let's cluster these people here, give them access to these things, make their system of petitioning that we would never create America as it exists right now.
Well, actually, to build one more on your point, it's not even a question of would we cluster Black people in DC. You would say there are all these Black people who live in DC. Yes. Would we not give that a Senate seat?
Correct. Would the people who live here have no say in the Supreme Court? No, we would never create it that way.
You wouldn't do that.
Right. But then beyond that, though, you have this question of, as the country shifts and changes in the demographics of the people who occupy it, what does it look like? How are the people who are arriving being treated? And how are they being given the full benefits of the promises of our founding documents or not, right? And so for example, and I think this is an interesting one, right? Where I think you could probably argue it either way. I mean, I've got a sense, but Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, came out a few weeks ago and said that if he was elected president, he would get rid of birthright citizenship, which, first of all, it's worth noting he could not do as president. That would require a constitutional amendment, right? So let's be clear. This is someone who is choosing to campaign on political rhetoric that is in no way possible to play to something, right? The constituency of people and I think that's where we have to start trying to figure out, is this a values issue or is this a policy debate, right? Mm-hmm. There's a world in which one could argue, having reviewed the numbers at this moment in time, the the policy of birthright citizenship no longer serves our democracy for X, Y, and Z reasons, and this is why I would propose doing it, and X, Y, and Z. And this is how we would functionally change it, and this is what we should do. And it's something much different at a time when historically unprecedented in our country, immigration from Central and South America is changing the ethnic demographics of the country, to come out and declare people who arrive here tomorrow will not receive the same rights as the people who arrived here when my grandparents got here, right? That there is a fundamentally racialized component to it because reality is racialized. We're not having a conversation in an academic debate club, or right. You're saying this not in a policy context, in a political context. You're making this claim not because you are making some staid policy argument for what's best for us. You're saying it because you believe it will motivate people to vote for you, right? And because you couldn't even do it. And so that's where, to me, someone who would deny a immigrant who arrives in the United States tomorrow, who happens to be a person of color, who's more likely to be a person of color than at previous points in history, would deny them the same constitutional rights as my white mother's grandparents had when they arrived from England. I think there's a real argument there about whether or not this is someone who supports, who is attempting to push back on multiracial democracy, right? And that's all on top of the voting rights stuff, right? That's all on top of all that which all exist, right? It's this question of who is really and truly American, because a multiracial democracy is one in which there is a true equality under the law, equity of opportunity, and there's debates about equity and what it means and how you apply it, and there's a ton to that, right? But in our ideal, the world is that no matter what our history has been, anyone born tomorrow has a relatively level playing field, right? It's relatively similar access to opportunity, and so what does it mean for us? What does that mean, and what does that look like? And there are policy debates about things that functionally make that not be the case. But then secondarily, and this is a lot what I talk about in the book, is there's political rhetoric that, whether you take it literally or not, literally or seriously, is not the rhetoric of someone who takes multiracial democracy seriously, right? Like, and I think we encounter that. I mean, the last thing I'll note is that, there are any number of reasons that contribute to the election of someone like Donald Trump or the rise of his movement. But even with just a little bit of hindsight, we look back and it's like, look, a black man was elected president, and someone was able to become such a powerful political figure that they were the next person elected president on a platform that was largely at their political rise. That black guy's not really one of us.
Yeah, and quick thing, right? I think that's this is actually why you and I are the same age. So you rooting the book, and back when we were in high school, and 2008 with Obama's election is really key, because I think it's actually most helpful to judge Donald Trump not by 2015, not even by like build the wall, but like by 2011, because once again, and this is why I love your point about like values versus policy debate. Like, end of the day, like, there is an entirely good faith construction of getting to like build the wall. Like there just is. Like, that's a debate about how, like, Stephen Miller, I think this is actually a useful like debating tactic, but he just says, okay, Emma Lazarus, like, let people in, like, what's the number? Like, well, whatever. The point is, we don't actually know the number, therefore it's a policy debate. But birtherism is actually just pure racialized hatred. There's no debate there. That is the way to understand that rooting there.
Well, it's that. And then you have issues that sit in between that. So another one early from the Donald Trump playbook is the quote unquote Ground Zero mosque, which was not a mosque, not based at Ground Zero, right? And so you have
we're in the last few questions, but can you please contextualize for people, because this is the most TBT thing you've said the entire. It's
a deep cut, and so it's very interesting, because Jeremy Peters of the New York Times wrote a book a year or two ago. I'm not going to remember the title of it right now, but he looks.
Insurgency. I had him on the show.
Yes. Yeah. But one of the things he notes in the polling and in the rise is how the quote unquote ground zero mosque was an important turning point, right? I think sometimes we forget it because of what it was, and it feels like kind of a 9/11 stuff all kind of feels Bush era, and so then when we pivot to Obama, we kind of forget all of it. But what happens with Obama doesn't all start the day Obama announces stuff. So so there was if I recall this fully correctly, and I'm sure folks will fact check me on it, but there was a community center, an Islamic community center, that had purchased space in New York City, not far from the site of the World Trade Center. Now, this is in the years following 9/11. The World Trade Center is currently going through its reconstruction, the creation of the memorial, X, Y, and Z. But a few blocks away, if I recall correctly, some Muslims put together a community center. And in part of their initial rationale was that they thought it was important to show some kind of solidarity. But the point was, this became something that was extensively demagogued in the conservative media and among right-wing politicians. It was called the Ground Zero Mosque. And were you to watch Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity or listen to Rush Limbaugh or Glenn Beck, you were under the impression that they were building a mosque at the site of the deadliest Islamic act of terror in American history. Well, you understand how that is a far more inflammatory framing, where people of all types of background might have just some practical, is that wise, is it not? Back and forth, right? But the problem was, you could take something that might be a good faith, but that's not what it was. That's not actually what the underlying facts showed was happening, that it was all founded in a lie, that something was happening that was not happening, but that played to people's prejudice about Muslims and and I don't even mean prejudice in some because when we use prejudice, I think it's important to always note, we all have prejudice. We all have, prejudice is not in and of itself a bad thing. It's the application of it and the living out of it that is the bad thing, right? We all walk down the street and go, is that man cute or is he ugly? Or that person seems friendly or scary. That's a prejudice. We don't know anything about them, right? Mm-hmm. It's based on and so people had a prejudice against people who were different than them, people who might be associated with someone who had done harm but cynically playing on it for these political purposes in ways that specifically riles an anxious group of people. One, like I said, I would argue in these racialized contexts, right, clearly results in movements that we're a country that we're trying to get to equal and get to even, that this is energy in the other direction, because it drives those wedges and creates that suspicion between people groups. But secondarily, what we know is it leads, that type of dehumanization can lead to violence against people, right? And so I just say all that to say that we see time and time again this application of a cynical racialized politics. As you noted, we can have a border debate all we want about what the exact right policy way is to address. This came up, Sean Hannity and Gavin Newsom did an interview recently. Mm-hmm. And there's this moment where Hannity starts talking about the border wall, and Gavin Newsom goes, I support reinforcing the structure, and I'm a governor of a state with the border of Mexico, and with one of the longest ones. That even as we talk about these issues, and I think this is particularly hard for the media to navigate sometimes, we're very often not actually talking about the issue. Mm-hmm. That it is, in fact, people overuse dog whistle or what. I don't even need to get into the intent of the speaker. The reality is the impact is not, people vote based on vibes, not on facts. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when you have a rhetoric or a set of proposed policies that cut in a specific direction in this way, it's very hard to unintertwine exactly where, like I said, that values and policy cuts it. And you can understand why people who have a very literal skin in the game for the future of multiracial democracy and is it safe for me to exist the way I exist, don't always have the biggest attention span for debates about exactly where the line is, right? Because,
So here's the last question. And you kind of get this at the start of the book, discussing how Italian Americans were considered different from a, race to social construct perspective in the 19th century and early 20th century. To what degree do you see little, green shoots of this entire racialized context changing? listeners are going to know the kind of talking points on this one. Hispanic men, not overwhelmingly, but like, we could see the future of a different style of politics moved a little more towards Trump than you would have expected. Obviously, you have precedents in a state like Texas of like Hispanics gradually whitening or merging more into the white majority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you and I are looking back, because once again, we're the same age, at an America of 2050, to what degree is our imagination hampered by us imagining this issue in context in a 1990s sense versus hey, like we're going to totally, or we could figure out this in a different context?
I think that's all really good context. I think that there's a real question about the immigration of refugee groups and Hispanic American groups, and as it relates to whiteness, however it's defined, right? I think you're right in that there's definitely it cuts both ways, because you had a kind of, again, I actually think the Obama years in media and in politics were a blinding and intoxicating exercise, at least at the very beginning, in like white liberal delusion, right? Yes. That there was this deep desire for this to have meant that we weren't racist anymore, and we were the generation that fixed it, and we solved everything, and it's post-racial America, and our friend Barack Obama's the president, but now we're gonna do a woman, then we're gonna do a gay guy, then we're gonna and it was just this kind of like, and that it was all gonna, like, everything was just gonna keep getting like better from their perspective year over year, and there wasn't going to be, and demographics were going to be destiny, right? And so it was going to be this Obama multiracial coalition, that the Democrats were going to be able to have this party with all these white people and the Hispanics and the Black people and that very quickly dissipated, right? For any number of reasons, right? One, because it has to be said, Barack Obama is a uniquely generationally talented politician. Right.
Couple confounding variables there.
But the two, what we know is that there's something about we know that people's views are malleable, right? And so, for example, in conversations about to what extent did racial animus play into Trump's election, people would like to talk about Obama to Trump voters, as if one could not vote for a Black guy for a powerful position, then consume 8 years of racist propaganda about them and not come out the other side not so happy with him, right? Or that could not have a racial animus that's based and founded in immigration or in Islamic terror or any number of other things that might be racial animus that might not have prevented you from voting for a Black guy and then voting for Donald Trump. But then three, there was this expectation that Hispanic Americans who came to this country would racialize themselves differently than every other immigrant group that has ever arrived in the United States of America, right? In mass. That what we see is, at best, immigrant groups that arrive in the United States of America end up splitting about 50-50 across the political spectrum, right? That you'd look at African immigrants and you will see conservative voters and you'll see hyper-liberal voters. You look at Asian American immigrants, and that's such a broad category, but if you look at Filipino immigrants, you look at Vietnamese immigrants, you look at Korean immigrants, you're going to see a spectrum, right? If you look at, and then when you racialize that, when you look at groups of people who've arrived in the United States and have been racialized as non-white, to a group, what they have sought to do is assimilate into whiteness, to be seen as closer to whiteness than blackness, right? The Irish are now white. The Italians are now white. The Jews are primarily now white. The Jews are not a racial group, they're a racial ethnic group, but they were conceptualized as a racial group at the time, right? The Asian American groups that have arrived, you have the rise of this concept and this conceptualization of the model minority and how they are used as a cudgel between Black appearing groups and white appearing groups, right? There's been no racialized group that has arrived and writ large said, yeah, we're with the Black people. Well, why? Well, why would you do that? You arrive in a country where the plague field disadvantages one group and advantages the other. Common sense is going to tell you what group you are incentivized to take common cause with, to assimilate into, to build yourself into.
Well,
and so I think that
one quick pushback.
Go ahead.
I think the pushback would just be, I'm not sure it's that, like, what, so you could tell us if you're a listener, you know my last name. My last name is Kozlov, adopted Ukrainian Jewish family. If I'm imagining my adoptive great-great-grandparents, Ellis Island, early 1900s, it's not that they would say, ah, man, like, sucks that we're like with the blacks here. I think they would say that we are not part of the American norm, and the American norm is white. That's just like the like little
100%. No, that's correct, right? It's an assimilation into whiteness, right? Now, among the ways that is done in a group sense, not an individualized sense, can become the definition against, right? And against, this is interesting. You guys, and you know this in Texas, right? It's why immigrants and Hispanic Americans very often, among the reasons why they very often support among the most punitive immigration policies, is that there's a line of political thinking around Hispanic Americans where part of their acceptance and their safety requires them to be defined against those other ones. No. We came here the right way. We do this way. Yeah, build a wall. Yes, lock them up. Because that's not us. That's them, right? That there's a creation of a definition in a separatism there, right? And so I think it's a very, as we look forward, though, to actually answer your question, I think that what happens, so one, what happens when geopolitics changes who is showing up at our borders, right? That there's a belief that immigration and our refugee crises around the country will work exactly the way they're working now. Well, what happens if there's another massive ground war in Europe that involves a bunch of countries and creates millions of people who would be socialized as white refugees? What happens if the quote unquote browning of America? What happens if something happens in Asia that creates a massive demographic shift where now people from China or Japan are coming at the numbers that we're now seeing in Central South America, right? What happens if something implodes in Brazil and suddenly we have a bunch of South Americans who are in appearance much more white than many of the Central and South Americans showing up currently? They start showing up, right? That our understanding of what is to come and our projection of what is to come is so fatally limited by what's happening exactly right now, and our complete inability to guess what will happen around the corner, what will happen tomorrow. I mean, this brings us full circle to what we were talking about with, legacy of defund and some of these other kind of moments is that we are often so limited by a presentism. What's happening in this exact moment must continue to happen exactly the way it is happening forever. And what we've seen is that there are just too many inputs across the way. There could be a coup in a country we've never heard of tomorrow that fundamentally changes American history, right? And we don't know what that will look like and how it'll operate. There could be an action by elected officials in the United States of America, right? We're a union of 50 states. What happens if that changes? It expands or it contracts, and I don't want to get predictive about any of those things. I'm just going to say it could happen, right? We don't know. And I think that because of that, I'm sure that there's plenty of stuff I'm saying right now that 2050, our kids are going to be doing a podcast together talking about their dumb parents and what they all the wrong things that they said, because we are there's a quote that historians are historical, that they write in the moment in which they are writing. Yeah, the questions they ask are based on their preconceptions and the moment. That in this moment, this is a smart question to ask, right? And that there's something both revelatory and revealing about that, right? And so the fact that we are having these conversations right now says something about the moment we are in, whether or not anything we say is true or not.
100% true. Well, Wesley, this has been really fun, despite how like heady and serious the topic is. Could you just shout the name of the book out so folks who want to pick up where this conversation left off can go next?
Sure. It's American Whitelash, Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. It's available wherever you get your books. And I truly, I love this conversation. This was really thoughtful. I think that there's not enough conversation at this level very often, in part because I think so much of our public dialogue is so partisan. It's so in the like Republicans, Democrats framing that it gets rid of our ability to have both values conversations and policy conversations. All we can have is political conversations. Yeah. Right. And so I say that to say that anyone's listening who wants to, email me and tell me I'm full of shit, I will read it and respond. Like I enjoy the back and forth. I enjoy the sharpening of my thought process and ideas through feedback, right? Because I think as a journalist, it's my job to ask questions. It's my job to analyze evidence as it comes, right? And it's my job to say what I think the evidence means, but not ever to be foreclosed on receiving new information and receiving new perspectives, if only so that I can be a more compelling communicator by anticipating what the rebuttal will be. And so I say a lot to say, love the conversation and happy to have similar ones with anyone who's listening.
And real quick, let me yes and that, because you've given me a soapbox opportunity. I really appreciate what you said about the, Democrat Republican politics thing. Like there are definitely some listeners who will want me to have turned this into a debate, but I was really, and this is what I was trying to get at with the start of the episode. Like I am interested in understanding your viewpoint. You're coming at this from a different perspective than I am. And I think there's just this isn't just the like dunking on the debate me bro instinct. It's just sort of like, I'm not interested when I'm talking to a guy like you and like debating it. It's really helpful to understand how you're thinking about things. So thanks for being a great guest for that.
Of course, and vice versa, right? Because I think that I steal that line from, there's a media critic, James Fallows, who wrote that the partisan nature and the conflict nature of the media gets us away from discussion of common solutions to common problems. Mm-hmm. And I think about that so often as what should be the foundation of things functioning as a public square and as members of the media, in so much as we help facilitate the public square. We're not gatekeepers, right? Anyone can, but to the extent to which our job is to try to make it be a productive conversation, right? An informed conversation grounded in shared reality and facts, right? That is, in so much as that is our desire, I feel like the point of our public square is the point of debate, the point of dialogue is to find common solutions to common problems, right? That no matter what our politics is, none of us, that we all are lesser than, even if just at like a theoretical moral level, if we occupy a country that is unequal, right? That we are all better off, I believe, for a country that is equal, or that is better, that is better functioning. And so the reason we want to create such a world is for all of us, right? And so therefore, the places where we go to work that out, we've got to, what does it look like to have a conversation that's less ends justify the means? I'm owning this person so that, and rather that is like, no, the point of us sitting here so that we can find a common solution to a common problem, which means I've got to understand where you're coming from. You've got to understand where I'm coming from. And as we all know from our interpersonal relationships, we can know someone very well and still say something to them, and they take it totally differently than we intended it. Right. My girlfriend would let me know that, and my mother would, my brothers. Right. Right. So now imagine someone who we don't know that well, whose politics are different, whose experiences are different. And we're like, all right, let's talk about the hardest things in the history of humanity in 42 seconds on cable TV, right? or in sentence fragments on the internet, right? Like that the more we can create space to actually interrogate, to ask those follow-up questions, to be active and engaged, good faith listeners, where we're not looking for you tripped up and said the thing, so now but we're actually trying to hear each other. It creates a space where, look, I don't think we've solved any of the world's great problems here, but I would
speak for yourself. I think we've entirely solved policing, federalism,
it's all done. Guns, like democracy. But I would like to suggest that the amount of time we spent today is a step closer to it than a lot of ways we might have spent, X number of minutes talking about these things.
For sure. Well said. Wesley, thanks again for joining me on the Realignment.
Of course. Appreciate you.